Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. Great to see you all here. My name is Marcia Eli, and I have the great pleasure of greeting you tonight on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, the library's Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents, and my colleagues here at the Center for Brooklyn History. Tonight we delve into turbulent territory, to say the least. The title of the program, The Embattled University, captures it all. As the new academic year starts, with tensions on campuses picking up, we are enormously fortunate to be joined by three deeply experienced former and current leaders of the Academy who share with us their well-considered sage perspectives. I'm delighted to acknowledge the folks in the audience from the New York Academy of Science and share my heartfelt thanks to you for all your partnership on this event. Following the conversation, our guests will take questions from you. As you came in, you were given an index card and a pencil. If you didn't get one and want one, just when the ushers come up and down, just signal that and they'll give you one. In about 20, 30 minutes, they'll start to collect those, pass them to the end of the row, and towards the end of the program, we'll take as many of those questions as there is time for. So now I'm just going to get straight to telling you about our distinguished guests. Nicholas B. Dirks is President and CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences. Previously, he served as Chancellor of the University of California, Berkeley, and Executive Vice President and Dean of the Faculty for Arts and Sciences at Columbia University. A leading scholar of South Asian history, anthropology, and post-colonial studies, he is the author of 8 books, including, and most pertinent to tonight, City of Intellect, The Uses and Abuses of the University. Katherine E. Fleming is President and CEO of the J. Paul Getty Trust, and an internationally recognized scholar of Mediterranean history, religion, and culture. She was Provost of New York University from 2016 to 2022 and holds the A.S. Onassis Chair of Hellenic Culture and Civilization in NYU's Department of History. She serves on the boards of several institutions, including Barnard College, the John S. Latsis Public Benefit Foundation, and the Universities of Paris system. Her career began in California. After earning her doctorate at UC Berkeley, she went on to teach at various institutions in Southern California before moving to NYU in 1988. And Josef Sorett is Dean of Columbia College, Vice President for Undergraduate Education, and Henry L. and Lucy G. Moses Professor. A professor of religion and African American and African diaspora studies, he has served on the faculty at Columbia since 2009. A scholar of religion and race and American culture, Dean Sorett has published 3 books, along with numerous academic articles and popular essays. They range in topic from popular music to literary history. His most recent book, Black is a Church, Christianity, and the Contours of African American Life, came out in 2023. I am so grateful to all of you for being here, and it's truly an honor to host you. Please help me welcome our speakers to the stage.
Can you hear me all right? So thank you for that wonderful introduction, and it is great to be here in the Brooklyn Historical Society, and thank you all for coming this evening. We're actually looking forward to this in part because the three of us haven't yet been able to have a conversation together. We've talked one-on-one, but there were lots of things going on this summer, particularly, I imagine, at my old university, Columbia, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, in 2024, any of you who are following university life will know that to be a tenured professor at a university like Columbia or Berkeley or NYU is a very, very rare privilege. We are at a time when we'll get to all kinds of challenges that universities are facing and all kinds of reasons they are embattled. But one of them is that there are financial issues that go across the university. There are concerns, the university world. There are concerns about the cost of higher education. In 2011, 2012, the amount of student debt in the United States went up over $1 trillion, and it's been doubled, if not more than that by now. And at the same time, there's been growing pressure on precisely the kinds of academic fields represented on the stage this evening. Historians, anthropologists, students, scholars of religion, we had great lives. So I want to begin by asking my colleagues just to say a little bit about how they, first of all, got into the university world, what their primary interests are in terms of their academic work, but then what possessed them to turn to the administrative life. There are colleagues of ours who think we go to something called the dark side when we take jobs like being a dean or being a provost or being a chancellor. But just to introduce ourselves to you a little bit more than the formal bios, I think it would be nice to just give you a little sense of the journeys that we took that got us to a place where we're talking to you about the university from the point of view of people who have either served in the administration or are currently serving in the senior administration of a major university, and that too, universities that have been in the news a lot of late. So Katherine, can I start with you?
Absolutely, thank you. So I wound up becoming an academic almost by default. I grew up in an academic household. My father is a retired medievalist, so the humanities were something that also seemed like a completely normal path to take. And at the same time, my decision to become an academic was driven by two things, one unusual and one, I hope, usual. The usual one is that I had the experience as an undergraduate of taking a course with a professor who got me intellectually excited about comparative religion. And it was a course that I took purely by happenstance because I needed something that was going to give me 4 credits and that was meeting on a Wednesday afternoon. And that was the course that met those criteria. And it just turned out that the person that the instructor was someone who, for whatever reason, I found super, super compelling intellectually, and I found the course material super compelling intellectually. It would be my hope that every single undergraduate have that experience. It doesn't even matter what the material is that they connect to, but I connected to this material and consequently became a religion major as an undergraduate. Then the pure kind of happenstance thing is that I dropped out of college in the middle of college and took a job as a waitress in a village of 40 people on the southwest coast of Crete, which was a really, really nice place to be in the 1980s, and learned really good Greek and decided that I wanted to do something with it, and wound up taking an academic path that made use of a language that I had learned. So it was sort of a combination of inevitability and total randomness. As to why I became an administrator, we can talk about that later.
Sure. Let me just begin by echoing Nick's gratitude to everyone for being here this evening, to the conversation, and for the book, of course, that provides an occasion to think about higher ed together. It's just great to be thinking together. And I guess what I might mention by way of biography is, in the book, the kind of religious history of the academy that you provide, and in some ways the religious biographies that I don't want to assume a shared biography, but the religious backstories and the story that you tell in the book, in part about what begins as maybe a religious quest becomes something else along the way. I think that was very much my own story, but by way of profession, I was actually pre-med as an undergraduate and aspiring athlete. And so my path certainly was not planned in this way. I figured I would become a orthopedist or sports medicine of some sorts because my basketball career was not going to go beyond college. But in the same way, my junior year of college, a set of more personal questions that were not being answered in organic lab led me to a class with about 12 students in Black theology, which at a place like Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, which is typically described as the buckle of the Bible Belt, opened up a set of questions where I was thinking about the sort of relationship between, I think I wrote a paper on the relationship between spiritual and racial identity. That only 15 years later had I realized that I was mapping out what would become a career after 5 years of undergraduate, a set of questions that began at the personal level theologically, leading me to do a Master of Divinity, and eventually ended up to doing a PhD back home in Boston in African American Studies, where my own orientation was thinking about the connection between the resources and the set of questions that animated academic life, how they might be, and I think this part of the book as well, the sort of porosity between the university and the broader world that is often not the narrative we tell about the academy. Thinking outward from my own scholarly training, in many ways led me to never think that I would be on a path of academic leadership. And I guess I'll follow Katherine and punt that part of the question for a moment, although I find it to be deeply rewarding work. It was not the path that I had mapped for myself as a scholar of religion in African American studies.
So I had actually imagined this to be the case. I wasn't absolutely sure, but I suspected that all three of us are three academics who did not go into university life thinking that we would have these kinds of roles. And that seems to be borne out by what they've said. Certainly, I did not. As Josef said, I've written a book about this, The City of Intellect. The first half of it is a kind of memoir, so I go into great detail about my own journey, which included not Oral Roberts University, but it did include, 2 baptisms and a lot of religious inquiry. And what my Sunday school teacher told me would happen happened. I went to college and I lost my faith, but I kind of fell, if not in love, certainly I became enamored by the university, and it's been an extraordinary home to be in. But we all did, at some point, migrate into administrative roles. And the story is, for people like us often, that, we like to get things done. Somebody either made us chair, and that worked, and then we were, asked to do other things, and of course, I think I can speak for all of us to say we were all kind of aware that when you go into a leadership role beyond a particular department, and many academics live fairly exclusively within their departments, you get exposed to a world that is much, much larger. The university is huge. Those of us in the arts and sciences think the arts and sciences is everything. It's usually 28 to 32 departments, from chemistry to classics. But if you talk to somebody in the medical school, leave alone any of the other professional schools in a large university like the ones that we've worked in, arts and sciences is just over on the side. It's just part of a much larger, much more complex university, all of which in various ways and to various extents we've experienced. But in my case, I indeed became a chair, was asked to be a dean. That was a dean that used to have somebody in your position reporting to me, I'll just mention.
There's a history there.
Yeah, there is a long history.
It's weird.
Yeah, well.
Special.
But, then I got the opportunity to go to Berkeley as chancellor, and I couldn't say no. But when I went to Berkeley, and this I do want to sort of just, sort of lay out there, I went to a great university that is ranked alongside, certainly in the fields in which we work, alongside the very best universities in the world. But it was a very different place. Katherine was there as a graduate student, and it's a great place to do your undergraduate or your graduate study. But when you go in as an administrator, you learn about the fact that you're part of a public system in which issues around cost, and I want to come back to cost, are front and center. And they were certainly front and center in California in 2012. It was 4 years after the Great Recession. The state of California cut the budget of the University of California by more than 50% in the 2 years after the downturn. And tuition was raised, basically doubled in the course of 3 years. There were massive protests. Those protests over tuition, of course, coincided with the Occupy movement and were in some ways enlivened by, if not in part driven by, growing and pervasive discontent that, of course, is part of our contemporary political history around everything from growing inequality to, in the case of institutions like universities, the inordinate cost of getting a college education. And of course, in the context of an economic downturn, growing concern about the fact that the more you pay, the less you get. The less you get certainly in the way of training for a career that is actually going to give you enough money to, first of all, pay back your college debt, and then, have a family, buy a house, do the kind of career you want to do without thinking about just being underwater constantly about finances. And so I arrived in California to find that I was in the middle of protests over tuition that were incredibly loud and incredibly, I think, important for me to reckon with as a kind of surround fact of university life. At Columbia, and I dare say at NYU in the years when I was there certainly, tuition was raised every year by 3%. Now, there was a lot of money for financial aid, but it was a very different kind of setting. And so those issues of cost, even though the tuition was 4 times as much at a place like Columbia and NYU as at Berkeley or UCLA, I immediately came to see that what I had to some extent taken for granted was really something that was the fundamental fact of American life vis-a-vis the university, which is it just cost too much. So, Katherine, you managed a huge budget as provost. NYU has a very different kind of financial history than, say, a Columbia, certainly of a Harvard or a Princeton or a Stanford, or Yale, which have very large endowments. And I wonder if you could both say a little bit about, beginning with you, Katherine, about what you begin to learn about the university when you do go into an administrative role, and how that begins to shape a different way of thinking, not just about the university, but about what you're doing in it, compared to how you were as a member of faculty, and to some extent vis-a-vis your colleagues on the faculty.
Well, you certainly understand the ugly realities of budget. NYU, as is the case with most other American universities, is a not-for-profit entity, meaning it can't profit. Ideally, you end up with a balanced budget at the end. You're spending about as much as you're taking in. It, in the abstract, seems like a wealthy university. It has a $4 billion endowment, but if you pause to consider the fact that the annual budget downtown, don't consider MAD, is $6 billion, the university could function for about 8 months with no revenue source other than just spending down its endowment. Princeton University could exist for over 30 years if all it did was live off of its endowment. But NYU and other similarly endowed institutions are considered sort of competitors to places like Princeton. I mean, when we talk about higher education and the university under siege, we're really talking about 50 different institutions, more or less. There are hundreds and hundreds of universities in this country that operate on a very different model and don't have the kinds of privileges and problems that the institutions that implicitly are the topic of tonight's conversation have. So one of the things you realize is yeah, it would be great if the faculty got paid more. And it would also be great if tuition cost less. And it would also be wonderful if we had far more resources available. But it's impossible, because the only way that you can bring in more revenue is either through development, which in some instances means getting into bed with people that you'd prefer not to be in bed with, or raising tuition, or seeking more federal funding. And then we see what happens when the government can threaten you and tell you that if you don't behave in ways that they want you to behave, they're going to take away your federal funding. You really are in a major bind, and I became aware of this, fairly early on, but very acutely so during COVID. I had both the blessing and the curse of being effectively, like you have war presidents. I was like the COVID provost. The first half of my time as provost was pre-COVID, and then the remaining 3 years of it were during COVID. And there were all kinds of people who had all kinds of need that arose from that situation. And the university administration was under intense pressure to service everybody's needs, which was an impossibility given our budget. And we decided that what we were going to go for was making sure that nobody at the university lost their job. That we decided that was what we were going to do. No one was going to take a pay cut, and no one was going to lose their job. And that was the way we were going to meet sort of an ethical obligation to our community. But all the other things that people wanted us to do, extra years of funding for graduate students, time off for people, were literally an impossibility. It's like a cash operation. It was like if you didn't have people coming in the door and paying you tuition, we wouldn't have the money to make payroll. Literally, we were having conversations about that. And I don't think most of my colleagues were aware of that, although I tried to make some of them aware of it in one memorable context, but I would need a drink before sharing it with you.
Trying to think. So I won't go on further on the budgetary front, but I think on something that Katherine mentioned there at the end about making a decision, and I think the language that one did not drive many of my conversations as a faculty member was the language of trade-offs. That somehow seems to be a unifying language, and so making a decision that is going to prioritize no one losing their job or no one taking a pay cut. I think I entered into position of chair where during the COVID period, that my first semester's chair was remote, and a set of questions were being asked then about graduate education, and what size of graduate programs. And so I think the first experience I had was leading a very small department about what did it mean to forego a cohort as a way of thinking about across graduate education, across the arts and science, when so much of graduate education is this, I think, another really big theme, whether our primary mode of thinking should be within our fields and departments or across the broader university. And Nick, you inviting us and to think, and inviting your colleagues to think outside of departments in different ways. So thinking across the arts and science about graduate education and what that meant for the work of, say, one cohort of graduate students in religion. I think what was most eye-opening in moving from department chair into the position of dean is the responsibility one has to a staff. Right? As the chair of a very small department of religion, there were 2 staff members and a budget that one need not even discuss, right? It was that nominal budget at best. And then to step into a position of dean of the college where there are more than 300 staff who expect leadership in a different kind of way and who really make the university go, make so much of what our students experience possible, make faculty lives possible in different kind of ways, and feel responsibility to steward and support staff who had already made it through multiple crises by the time I stepped into the role, even before the challenges of the last couple years. And what does it mean to support and think through what staff need in a moment to encourage them along the way within the set of budgetary constraints that I think Katherine described so aptly. I am both heartened and inspired every day by the amazing work that our staff do to make faculty and student lives possible. But that was an education of itself, to think about what it meant to be responsible and a steward of that work.
So, I mean, the one thing that I want to add to this has to do with the cost of tuition. I think most people don't realize that financial aid is a line item in the budget, just as, buying paper towels is. It's many hundreds of millions of dollars worth line item in the budget. And it, just like anything else, is funded by the same sources as everything else, right? Tuition. So you're in this kind of paradoxical spiral in that one of the only mechanisms you have available to you to lower the cost of education by increasing financial aid is by increasing tuition so that you have more revenue to fund your financial aid line. It's like a completely diabolical upward spiral. And it's complicated by the fact that I am prepared to call elite higher education a luxury good. Because let's face it, it is. And we are in this world in which we want it to be accessible to as many people as possible, but it's really the only good that when you go to purchase it, you show your tax forms first, and then you're told how much you're going to pay for it. And that is not the case with other things out there in the marketplace. But there's a price tag, you show how much you can pay, and then they tell you what the discounted price tag is for you, and the only thing paying that delta is a line item in your budget called financial aid, which is funded by, lo and behold, tuition. So it's a really crazy box that you're stuck in.
So when I went to Berkeley, one of the first visits I had was from Jerry Brown, who was governor of California at the time. He literally came to see me on my first visit to campus, and he told me that I should do various things, and that in particular I needed to bend the cost curve of higher education. He told me that when he had been a student at Berkeley, which he had been back in the 1960s, he paid $70 a semester. And even, factoring in inflation, he didn't pay very much, and it was virtually free. There are people here this evening from the City University of New York, a time when it was completely free. And the promise of public higher education in the US has always been that you can provide everyone a high quality education, albeit in different kinds of institutions at different scales and so on and so forth, but of course only if somebody else is paying. And if it's not going to be tuition, it will be state allocations. State allocations in California used to cover in the 60s approximately 80% of the university budget. In 2004, when my predecessor at Berkeley took over, the state funded about a third of the university budget. When I went, it was 12%. It's now around 10%. And of course, what makes that delta up in turn is, again, tuition, which is why tuition is now as much as $15,000 a year at Berkeley, which seems tiny in comparison with, but it's also in very expensive areas where you have the cost of living in addition to the cost of your tuition and fees. The point that I want to simply make is that public universities, private universities have very different kinds of budgetary realities, but they're all getting more expensive. And you either have the luxury good of a private university, or you have an increasingly scarce luxury good of a great flagship public university. But again, with all kinds of compromises that are being made around what people like us, university administrators, would like to be actually making available, which is a much lower cost education. But you do have to pay for research. You have to pay for faculty, and you're also paying for faculty who do research as well as education, which is a huge tension. But now I want to turn a little bit, having sort of set the stage, to some of the other kinds of issues that make the university an embattled place. So you begin, though, with this question of cost. You then have the problem of selectivity. Getting into these colleges and universities is harder and harder and harder. So even if you could potentially pay, or if your financial situation would qualify you for financial aid, you still have to get in. And even though there are wonderful colleges and universities across New York, across the state of New York, across the country. Everybody wants to go to the same 35 to 50 colleges and universities. There are great colleges and universities that can't find enough students to enroll right now. Every year there are headlines about colleges folding, being closed down, being acquired by a richer university somewhere else. My daughter graduated, for example, from Mills College in California after having dropped out of Columbia for 10 years to be a waitress in Emmy's Spaghetti Shack in San Francisco. But she then was able to go back to school and go to Mills. Mills closed down 3 years ago. Just couldn't pay the bills. And so there is this, this larger landscape in which many people think, we are not only too expensive, but we're too hard to get into, we're too exclusive. And then, in addition to everything else, we're teaching them things that they don't necessarily need. So I want to turn a little bit now to the humanities, the crisis of the humanities, the liberal arts, the purposes of education. And I want to turn to you, Josef, because as Dean of Columbia College, one of the obligations you have is to preserve and promote the Columbia core curriculum. And I can dare say this, that had it not been basically invented in 1919, 1920, 1921, first as a course on war and then as a course on peace, that's contemporary civilization, later literature, humanities, and other courses, other sequences that were added in, it would never be enacted today. There's just no way a faculty would get together and say, we want a core curriculum of any kind, leave alone a core curriculum that teaches the names of the great books, the authors of the great books that are emblazoned on the exterior of Butler Library. But could you say a little bit about what it is to preside over one of the only, University of Chicago has something like this, but one of the only core curricula in the country, and how you see that as something that is an enduring good that makes, in fact, an education at Columbia especially valuable, and not just an artifact of some ancient history.
Yeah, and I would say a countercultural good in some ways. Again, this is another story that runs throughout the book, the trend towards STEM, the trend towards specialization, and the like, that whether it's the critique of ethnic studies or the critique of the sort of substantive content critique, and then never mind the financial model that it takes to sustain a curriculum in which there is this really powerful shared experience. I think, of course, as you note, Nick, the core curriculum was founded to respond to a moment of crisis, and in many ways folks have, over the course of the last year, I think last fall this time, there was a piece by a dean out at Stanford, right? And we don't need to talk about the spring and the critique by Ross Douthat and others that come in, but in a moment of specialization, we think about a curriculum like at Stanford in the shadow of Silicon Valley, where the play between what happens on campus and what happens in industry seem to be so closely aligned. Stanford has, in fact, right, this piece by this dean is lauding the core curriculum's resistance to that trend, and that Stanford itself takes cues in the last couple of years to create a shared experience. So one could think about the set of curricular debates in the core curriculum as something that is inviting academia to slow down in some ways across those trends. And over time, it is as much about the books and as much about faculty and engaged in the shared experience as it is about the way in which the institution itself balances the tensions between tradition and innovation. That becomes a curricular force, but also a marker of identity that connects students to alums, right? So this is, when we talked a little bit about the investments of different constituencies, whether that be donors or alumni, we could talk about the books and the process of revising a syllabus to make sure that texts are responding to the moment. But often it's the encounter, I think, that I hear from current students and from previous students of a previous generation, our alum. It's the opportunity to engage with one another that unites students within a community that has grown increasingly diverse over time. And so, yes, we could think about the texts that are revised, what gets added, what might get dropped, but also the notion of a shared experience that brings a student body together and also connects them to preceding generations in ways that hold together this tension between tradition and innovation. So a marker of Columbia's unique contribution to this landscape that is always, I think, as one historian of the core writes, revising itself. I'll stop.
So, Katherine, I'll ask you to maybe say a little bit about how you see, now that you're looking from outside of the university, how you see the future of the humanities and the kinds of fields that you've worked in particular, that we work in, and you know, are there going to be a robust set of humanities departments and majors and faculty jobs and so on and so forth in 25 years? Or are we looking at something else?
I don't think there are going to be a robust set of jobs out there for freshly minted PhDs in the humanities. No, I do not. I, in fact, think that the university landscape is going to be pretty significantly I think that the university landscape is going to be pretty significantly transformed over the next 2 to 3 decades in ways that we can't fully envision right now, and those are things that are going to affect the humanities probably first and foremost, but they're going to affect all kinds of things, like the budgetary model that I just lamented. The kinds of things that we're all concerned about today, we're going to be nostalgic for the kinds of concerns that we have today in 30 years, in my view. So thank you very much for your defense of the core curriculum. It was the most cogent one that I have heard, and one that I actually find very compelling. I am a big believer in the fact that we are all enriched as part of a university that includes fields about which we know nothing and in which we have zero interest, right? So we used to have discussions, for example, about whether or not we should continue to offer Latin, even though only 2 people were taking Latin. And it felt to me, I don't know if anybody read the Harper's article about 6 years ago about language extinction. And in the same way that I feel sad or pain at the knowledge that a spoken language that has no connection to me, my culture, my history, or my geography, to know that it has died causes me pain. And I think it should cause everybody pain. The same can be said for animal extinction, for all kinds of extinctions. That's how I feel about many fields within the humanities. But that's an emotional argument. And I just told you all about the financial impasse at which many institutions find themselves. It's very difficult within that financial impasse not to say, look, we can save $75,000 a year by not offering Latin, or we could save $35,000 a year by not having a tenured professor teaching Latin, but instead by having some short-term instructor teach Latin. I think universities themselves have to be able to articulate why it matters for people to take courses in the humanities. I think Columbia University does that, arguably in an imperfect way in the form of the core curriculum. Other institutions try to do it via distribution requirements. But for the most part, if universities aren't forcing students to enroll in some of these courses, they will wither on the vine and cease to exist. I'm in the humanities, and I think the humanities do great things for the way people think, for their ability to empathize and imagine worlds of which they're not a part and never will be a part. Being a historian or reading works of literature gives you access to eras that are centuries behind us that otherwise we can have no apprehension of. I think that's an incredibly valuable thing. But when you have parents paying $100,000 a year to have their kid go to school, they probably want to feel that they're getting more out of it than for their kid to have had apprehension of a distant emotional world that they would otherwise have no access to. They want their kid to be doing something that's going to give them a decent paying job at the back end. And universities have to do a way better job of effectively compelling students to take these classes and mounting intelligent arguments as to why they should be compelled to take them. And in the current environment, I don't see a lot of places doing that.
So, we're preaching at least, I mean, we're preaching. Go ahead. Yeah.
And I was just to say, right, and it does have, I think, the trend towards homogenization or competing in a landscape of rankings, which is another thing. Where are the space for institutions to make their own argument about who they are in a space where we're all balancing the relationship between academic mission and the financial model? And I think certainly Columbia, while it has its own take on this, is not living it outside of those pressures, right? The most popular major across all 3 undergraduate schools at Columbia, one would not find surprising, is computer science. Yet, talking with faculty in the sciences and students in the natural sciences, the impact that the core has on how they think about their work, even on the way in which they're trained to write grants, right? The sort of, not to make an instrumentalist argument for the core, but the way it shapes the culture and impacts other fields. And even as humanities majors decline, contributes to a space in which maybe history and English majors are more robust at a place because of the distinct contribution that the core brings to a place like Columbia. So where is the space for that distinctive argument for an institutional identity in the broader landscape? So
Now, it happens to be the case, though, that it's much easier to make an argument for compelling students to take courses like these in universities where the degree, that is to say, the imprimatur, or as one says today, the brand of the university is what confers value, not the particular subject studied. And once you leave a certain kind of privileged world of top-ranked universities, that becomes much harder. And then the customer has even more power, because it is just, as I said, also with respect to declining enrollments in a lot of other colleges and universities, much more difficult to make that argument at a general level, but also to compel through distribution requirements or core courses or whatever mechanism might be used, students to take these courses. Now, at the same time this is happening, students, of course, want to do computer science. You can't blame students for wanting to get that kind of skill. I used to think at Columbia that, students would study the core, but then they would major in economics so they could get on the subway and go down and get a job at Goldman Sachs. And then I moved to Berkeley, and people would take, courses in rhetoric and courses in whatever, but then they would major in computer science and want to get on the freeway. There is no subway. To go down and get a job at Google or Facebook or now Meta, right? So that, that was the kind of pipeline. Now, what's interesting, of course, today is that increasingly we're being told that in 5-10 years, many coding jobs will disappear. Coding will be done by some next generation of a large language model, which will be adept at doing all kinds of things that will displace human labor. But we're also being told that some of the greatest challenges that we face as a society have to do with the ethical use of these new very powerful technologies. And so, I think we'll be able to continue to make arguments for why humanistic learning is important. But these arguments are in some ways getting harder to make. And when and the reason I wanted to lead with the cost question was precisely, Katherine, as you were putting it. You pay $100,000 a year. First of all, do you need to go to college for 4 years? You want to spend your first year just sort of floating around and taking courses that will open your mind to thinking about what the good life is? Well, maybe you want to get out there and actually try to find out if you could have a good life for yourself. And now, of course, we are in a moment when the university is even more under attack. Surveys have been done. How do people feel about universities? How do they feel about the curriculum that we teach? How do they feel about the value of a college education? Every year, fewer and fewer people actually think it has that much value. A lot of people who will not think it has much value still for their own children would like to have them go, but even that is beginning to change. At the same time, of course, there are all these different kinds of options that are increasingly available, online education, new kinds of credentialing, and there will be disruption, not at the level that is predicted in the Silicon Valley, but disruption having to do with micro-credentials and particular kind of skill-based programs that will train people to do certain kinds of jobs and so on and so forth. There will be this kind of steady erosion. But at the same time, of course, as all of that is happening, universities are seen as often places where left-wing ideas are being taught, where students are being trained, if not indoctrinated, to think that the world is divided into oppressors and oppressed, where fields like mine, which is to say the study of colonialism, have overtaken a field of history in which we really should be taught about why America has been such a great, exceptional country vis-a-vis the history of the world. And so I want to try to get into a little bit more of a, sort of contemporary discussion about where we think these kinds of points of rupture are going to be. Now, you said you don't think the humanities are going to be anywhere close to what they are today, leave alone what they were, say, 25, 30 years ago, in another 25 or 30 years. But universities are slow to change, right? So how do you think this is going to unfold? And let me, since I know we need to get to some other kinds of current questions, and how have the disruptions that have been taking place on college campuses affected this? And what do you think their ultimate impact is going to be? I will say one thing about the impact of the last year, which is that when I wrote my book about my time at Berkeley, among other things, I thought the years that I had spent between 2012 and 2017 were tumultuous years. I thought I'd seen just about everything. I'd seen protests over tuition. I'd seen very difficult issues emerge around intercollegiate athletics. I'd seen major controversies about sexual assaults among students and sexual harassment on the part of faculty and the like. I then experienced a major riot on the Berkeley campus when the Young Republican Club invited Milo Yiannopoulos to come and speak. And there was a pitched battle on the campus between Proud Boys on the one side and Antifa on the other, leading to hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage and then huge controversies over, who should be allowed to speak on a college campus, and why do you have a provocateur like Milo Yiannopoulos? I don't know if you know who he is. He's back in the news. It turns out he won't go away, but he was being funded by Breitbart News, and he had a very specific ideological agenda, which was to stir up trouble on college campuses, to show how intolerant these campuses really were and how they would have extreme speakers from the left speak, but if somebody from the right came and poked fun at someone, they would be driven out of town. So I'd like you both to speak a little bit about the current crisis, how you see it both connecting to the issues we've been talking about, but then taking on a kind of life of their own in terms of what the future viability of the things we care most about in the university might in fact be. Katherine?
So I'll say something on that, but I'm also going to say something on kind of what you started out with, which was like, what are the things that might bring about this change? You say universities are slow to change. I'm not prognosticating, but I can just put a few things on the table that if they happen, it's game over. What if major private universities in the city of New York have to start paying property tax? Well, that's one game over right there. What if the federal government, and this is a topic on which Democrats and Republicans agree, what if they decide that they are going to institute a cap on tuition? Game over. Total game over. Everyone thinks like, oh, that would be great. It would not be great. It would be game over for higher ed as we know it. Those are just two little examples, and I'm deliberately choosing ones that seem sort of benign and financial. People are like, why would universities ever change? Well, all that needs to happen is for one of the exogenous circumstances with which universities have happily lived for decades and decades and decades, thinking that it's immutable, to change, and it's game over for the model as we know it, and there are about 20 more that I could mention that I won't mention. As for trying to lure me into a discussion about what's going on university campuses today, I'm very happy to say that I'm not on a university campus today, so I can speak about it in the abstract, but the specific abstract thing that I'll say is that I find that there is a clash between the principle of free speech and academic freedom, and I don't even want to wade into what academic freedom actually does and does not mean. I'm happy to go with the wrong definition that everybody has in their head, and the point will still stand. On the one hand, and a at least decade-long history of universities being increasingly called upon to adjudicate the speech of others when it is found to be problematic or offensive by people who are exposed to it. So this is another like weird box that higher ed is in. On the one hand, if you say something that I find and that is categorized under, I don't want to go into Title IX, but that is deemed to be offensive or problematic speech, according to any one of a number of different externally set criteria, it is the institution's job to intervene and effectively prevent you from speaking to me that way. So that's one world that we inhabit. And then another world in which we inhabit is one in which, in another context, universities seem to be adjudicating what it is that people should say and preventing them from saying it in ways that I don't think necessarily are appropriate. But you kind of can't eat the cake and have it too. And universities have been forced into a world in which that's sort of exactly what they're having to negotiate. And I think people have become really, really confused. But I'll turn over to my Columbia University colleague to speak with greater knowledge about the facts at hand.
Thank you. I don't know that I have much. I mean, I think what you diagnose as confusion is maybe, and I think to not jump right into the present, I think about just the last decade. I mean, I think it was 7 or 8 years ago where there was a debate even within the core curriculum about whether or not to use trigger warnings, right? And there's a whole, right, one could set of pedagogical debates about trigger warnings, which is to say to give a nod that you're about to read something controversial or what have you before reading it, whether or not that helps or, sort of, I think the...
Having fun?
Yes. I mean, I think this real, in some ways, we have a set of languages of thinking about in the workplace I think, Nick, you talked about this, what constitutes a hostile environment. And academia as thinking about itself often as a different kind of workplace that has prioritized discomfort or the danger of ideas, I think in this new regulatory moment, up against also a set of debates around diversity of identities and ideas, has produced a set of questions that we have not yet quite figured out. I don't want to concede them as under the broad language of confusion, but a set of tensions that we are grappling to try to figure out with greater clarity both with regards to what it means in the space of regulation vis-a-vis the federal government, but also what it means in the space of community and culture and practice as the various kinds of community, even if the language of community is right for how we think about the various forms of difference that come together, live together on a college campus, and how we both support that. Because this, I will say for this year, I've heard many different opinions, but at the same time, some of the very same folks who are saying we have to prioritize safety in a new way are also saying we cannot shy away from asking the hardest questions and insisting that our students ask those hard questions. And that those arguments being made at the same time by many of the same people, to me, animates that tension right now.
So I think it's fair to say that there are tensions that lead to confusion, if I can mediate this a little bit. But the fact of the matter is that, you know, when you have in a public university, you're actually mandated to follow the First Amendment. It is a choice that is usually followed by private universities, but it's not a choice at Berkeley. You have to observe the First Amendment. Now, that doesn't mean quite what it would seem to, because there are limitations, and those limitations have, in the history of jurisprudence around this, accorded to the provisions of what is called time, place, and manner, a dispositive role vis-a-vis how free speech can be exercised, which is to say, you can say when, where, and how, under what kinds of conditions free speech can be exercised. You cannot say what that speech should be, right? So, again, I'm trying to compress this, but the point there is that you really don't have a choice on the one side. On the other side, you have Title IX and Title VI that mandate very specifically, and certainly of late, this has been interpreted and used not only by the Department of Education, but also by various members of Congress, to basically hold universities accountable for reported discrimination, harassment, and discrimination through speech acts that take place on campus. At the same time, again, just to go back to the free speech side, that a whole set of efforts on the part of some universities to suggest that hate speech was not allowable on campus, especially at the University of Michigan in the 1980s, turned out to lose in court. So, you know, hate speech doesn't cut, I mean, it has to meet the standard definition of calling out for, crying out fire in a crowded theater. A speech act that will lead, or very likely will lead to violence, not something that is hateful per se. Now that sits simply alongside very different kinds of mandates that are in Title VI and Title IX, and they are being actively enforced. So you have that. Then you have the rhetorical surround of that, which is that we want our campuses to be inclusive. We talk a lot about the importance of diversity, of equity, of inclusion, and even belonging. Okay, these are all terms that we use all the time on university campuses, on the one hand. On the other hand, and this is, I was told this in somewhat provocative ways when I was at Berkeley, and then you bring in Milo Yiannopoulos, who insults gay people, insults trans people, you know, just is violating every one of those mandates, and you're actually required to follow both. So it confuses a lot of people, but it's not just a tension; it's actually a contradiction. It's coming to a head now in terms of how this is going to be played out, because it's no longer just taking place in the old ways in which the Department of Education would come to a university and would require responses to charges that were made and do an investigation. These are now being done in congressional hearings, right? So this is going to take off. This is going to become more and more pronounced. Now, you said that at the same time that, you know, there's all of the stuff going on, there also are people who are asking people to ask hard questions and to have difficult conversations. we talk a lot about trying to stage those kinds of conversations, but is that really possible? And what kinds of impediments are just kind of built into our society right at the moment when we have the levels of polarization that we do? What makes us think that we can create something in the university that we haven't been able to create anywhere else? Katherine, do you want to start with that? Or
I'm happy to go to some questions.
oh, well,
Some other questions,
that was actually a question that I was taking. Yeah. I'll read it as a question. Let me just read it as a question. How are your institutions handling the anti-DEI backlash? I'm sorry, I elaborated on that question, but how are your institutions handling the anti-DEI backlash?
My current institution, there is not a lot of anti-DEI backlash, in part because the DEI muscle at the institution was fairly underdeveloped to begin with, and I think there's broad recognition of that at the institution. So there are, some very basic things that need to be done and that are being done. So we have not yet reached the point of backlash.
Yeah, I think I would. What I have seen, we could just say, as this first cycle post the SSFA, Supreme Court rule, if we think of admissions as just one space, what I have seen across our school is a rearticulation of a commitment to a diversity aspiration, while also a recognition of what it means to pursue a recognition of the challenges and opportunities attendant to pursuing that part of one's mission in a new legal regime, right? So it's not a backing off or a shying from a commitment to diversity in every sense, but it's a recognition that in different historical moments, there are constraints and possibilities for how one pursues that. And I think what I was thinking about in your earlier point about what makes the academy different, and I hate to keep going back to the book, but there's there's the institute, the complicated, and we've seen this play out even in these debates today. There's the academy, the complicated institution in the context of all the constraints that have been so clearly described. And then there's the thing that draws us to the academy before we're the administrator, before that I think is still there, which is the idea, the ambition for a place that can make these things possible, which is, I think you end with this like utopian piece, which is to say that something that draws us to the promise of what the academy could be. I'm not ready to relinquish that idea, nor to sound naive about the real challenges in this moment. And so, yeah.
So, Katherine, I'm going to ask you to think about your institution as still NYU, just to, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but there's an associated question that came from somebody in the audience about administrative bloat. Yeah. And it's related to even some of the critiques of DEI. It's not obviously restricted to it, but there is, on the part of some, concern that the cost of higher education has been driven up not only by the cost of research and so on and so forth, but also by the fact that universities have taken on so many different kinds of roles, and that in order to provide those roles, and you made a very eloquent, thanks to the staff who make the lives of faculty and students much better, and I take that point absolutely, but there are a lot of staff, and they cost, they're a major part of the university budget. So people are, everybody from faculty critics to people outside the university are criticizing administrative bloat. So do we have too many administrators?
No. No, we don't have too many administrators. We have a hell of a lot of administrators, but for the tasks that universities are expected to perform, I would say, if anything, we don't have enough. I mean, especially if you look at mental health resources and you look at the people working in mental health resources as also having an administrative function, which they do, we are nowhere near where we should be to be able to accommodate the need, much less the demand of the students. And it is easy, I mean, I'm going to say something super unpopular. University presidents should be paid more than they're paid at this point. I mean, who would want to do that job, Nick? No, look, it's tempting to look at that salary and say, okay, if we got rid of that salary, you could round up all of the decanal salaries at NYU. I mean, I know how much it totals. It's tempting to think that that would make a significant difference in the affordability of the institution. It would make virtually no discernible difference in the affordability of the institution. I understand on a purely emotional level, especially when you're a faculty member making a 10th or in some instances a 20th, what one of those salaries is. That doesn't feel good. You look like, am I working 1/20th as hard as they are? No, you're not. Just as I'm not working 1/20th as hard as, the head of Microsoft is, and they happen to be getting paid way more than 20 times than what I'm getting paid. It's a different job that has a different market and different economics attached to it. So I understand the argument on an emotional level, but on a practical dollars level, I mean, the new school recently sold the president's residence. There was huge pressure to do that because of the economics of the new school. I don't see that the new school has dug its way out of a hole because it sold the president's residence. What I see is that the president quit his job because it became unbearable. And I understand, again, emotively, I get the valence and the symbolism of it, but we have a much, much deeper underlying structural financial problem at universities than too many administrators with big salaries.
I'm going to defer to her answer.
So one of the questions here, actually, I'll just read it out because I find this amusing. Is a university president officially the worst job in academia? But let me transpose that a little bit to, basically, can a university president do anything right? And, let me turn to you. And I don't want you to talk about the specifics of Columbia. You're in the middle of it, and you have to be sensitive to information you have and perspectives that you have as part of your role. But is there a way to create a less perilous position for a president who is either on this side or that side, is either condemned by this political faction or that political faction, by the faculty or by Elise Stefanik, and what do we need to think about? Because if indeed, and I agree, of course, with you, Katherine, that university presidents and administrators have very hard jobs that unfortunately go with the territory and are required to actually deal with these kinds of questions, the epidemics of mental health, et cetera, et cetera. But is there a path forward, or is this going to be just another year of interim? The year of the interim is how,
Several, right.
Four of the 8 presidents in the Ivy League are interim. And, there's another 4. So what can be done?
Yeah, I mean, So what I'll say, which I think I try to say to my students a lot these days, and that I try to bring to the work of a much smaller role, one might say, as dean, is to, which I feel fortunate. I still think being dean is a great job, and I am heartened by the sort of curiosity and the humility that I see among my colleagues as deans who are trying to find their way through this moment. up against all that has been described and diagnosed tonight. I also feel great fortune that we have folks with a level of sophistication and intelligence and care for the value of what these institutions are in broader society, who have stepped up to try to find, whether under terms interim or permanent, to lead institutions that have such an important value as we figure out this moment. So I wonder, I don't know that the role is going to get any easier or less tenuous. I think that there is an incredibly talented group of folks who are committed to what these institutions represent, who are stepping up in really important ways to figure out the moment, which is bigger than I think, right? The role is incredibly important, and we're fortunate to have people stepping up into it. And I think the learning is as much about where the moment will lead us.
So we're almost at the end of our time, and we'll just have sort of last follow-on question, I guess. But Katherine, like me, you've left the university and joined a nonprofit. Do you feel you can do more and more valuable work in a different context than the university at this particular moment?
If I consider my work to be the advancement of the humanities, yes, absolutely. It depends how you define what the work is. But if you define it as the advancement of the humanities, absolutely. It's like the volume has been turned way down. As provost at NYU, I basically felt that I was like the call center, the customer complaint center for a huge organization. There was virtually no time to think about things that it might be great to do. It was all just responding to anything from like, I don't like the countertops in my apartment, to this student didn't get a visa, to this administrator used a word with me that I didn't like. And these are all important things in the microcosms within which they're taking place, but they utterly consumed my life. Utterly consumed my life. And I was extraordinarily unhappy by the end of my time in that job. I said I was lucky because of COVID. I was lucky in that it became clear to me what my job was. My job was to make sure nobody got fired. My job was to try and figure out how to get through to the end of COVID. And then when that happened, I decided to no longer be provost. But in my current job, yeah, I can think about like how to fund artists who wouldn't be able to produce great work without funding. I can think about how to create networks of museums in West Africa, France, and the Midwest of the United States, and California. I can think about how to launch the world's biggest artistic event, which is starting on September 15th and running through the middle of February across Southern California, without having 80 emails a day that I have to deal with as part of my job that represents something important to the person sending them and something that will make me batshit crazy in my own professional world.
That was good. So you see why two of the three of us are not in these roles right now, and yet I want to say you're doing such important work, Josef, and we know that you go to work every day in Hamilton Hall. Just saying, and it's it really is work that I think so much hangs on for the future of our world, that some of the values that we attach to the university, even if they are not by any means universally applied and actually real, are so are the kinds of things that might, on the other hand, help make us figure out how to muddle through and make for a better future. So thank you everyone for being here tonight. Really appreciate your questions and participation.